On a calm English morning, a routine train ride turns deadly, and the village whispers begin. But only Miss Marple sees the tiny clues hidden beneath the chaos, and the truth no one else suspects. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. I am your host, Elias. Please like this video and subscribe the channel to show your support. Chapter 1. Death in Carriage B. The morning air at Willowbrook Station carried the crisp promise of spring, touched with the faint sweetness of apple blossoms drifting from the nearby orchards. It was the sort of English morning one remembered fondly: pale sunshine, cool shadows, and the quiet bustle of villagers heading to and from their errands. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a soft dove-gray coat, stepped lightly onto the platform, pausing for a moment to let a group of chattering school children pass. She had spent the previous evening at the Willowbrook Spring Fete, having been invited to judge the floral arrangements, a task she performed with modest pleasure. Now, with the fete behind her, she was returning home to St. Mary Mead by way of the mid-morning Willowbrook London train, intending to change lines later. Carriage B was already busy when she stepped aboard. A group of ladies from the Women's Guild sat together, their gloved hands wrapped around paper-wrapped buns. By the window, a thin young woman in a faded blue coat watched the countryside with a distant, slightly nervous expression. At the far end of the carriage sat Mr. Albert Redfern, a stout, well-dressed gentleman with a briefcase tucked neatly at his side. Miss Marple recognized him vaguely as a businessman who kept occasional lodgings in the district. He was engrossed in a newspaper, frowning deeply at the financial pages. Miss Marple found a comfortable corner seat and settled herself with a small sigh of contentment. There was something very restful about train travel. One could watch the world glide by while also observing human nature in its small, unguarded moments. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime noticing such moments, always found them telling. The whistle blew, the engine shuddered, and the train began its steady journey through the rolling countryside. All seemed perfectly ordinary, but, as Miss Marple would later reflect, murder often hides behind the ordinary, comfortably, quietly, almost politely. Within minutes, the carriage settled into its natural rhythm. The rustle of newspapers, the soft clink of teacups from the refreshment trolley, and the muted hum of conversation. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, though she did not knit anymore. She used the bag to carry letters and spectacles, and withdrew a small magazine. She had no intention of reading it. Her pale blue eyes wandered, as they always did, taking in subtle details others overlooked. The young woman in the blue coat, Miss Edith Hull, sat with her hands tightly clasped, her foot tapping an anxious rhythm. She started every time the train whistle sounded. Miss Marple thought she resembled a canary newly freed from its cage, uncertain whether to fly or hide. Across the aisle, Mr. Lionel Crowthorne, the village solicitor, was speaking in a loud, cheerful voice that seemed too hearty to be quite genuine. He laughed at his own remarks, casting occasional glances down the carriage, as though checking who might be listening. Mr. Redfern, however, barely glanced up from his newspaper. The briefcase by his side bore signs of wear at the corners, as though handled frequently, and with some agitation. Miss Marple noticed, too, that he kept shifting the briefcase slightly closer to his leg, as though concerned someone might take it. When the refreshment trolley arrived, Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea with her usual quiet gratitude. Most of the passengers did the same. Mr. Redfern ordered strong tea and a small buttered scone, which he ate with abrupt, irritated movements. It was at this moment that Miss Marple saw something unusual. A brief, fleeting glance exchanged between Mr. Crowthorne and Miss Hawley, not familiarity, not friendliness, but something like fear. The train rattled down. Sunlight flickered through the windows. The world seemed calm, predictable, safe. Then the atmosphere changed. The first sign that something was wrong came as a soft, choking sound barely more than a strained gasp. Miss Marple turned her head just in time to see Mr. Redfern's newspaper slide from his fingers. His hand jerked toward his throat, knocking over his teacup. The brown liquid spread quickly across the table before dripping onto the floor. The women nearby cried out in alarm. Mr. Redfern slumped sideways in his seat, his face contorted in pain, his eyes widening with helpless terror. "Good gracious!" exclaimed one of the guild ladies. "Is he ill? Fetch the guard." Miss Marple rose immediately, moving with more steadiness than one might expect of an elderly woman. She approached the stricken man, noting the pallor of his skin, the rapid fluttering of his pulse at the throat, and the slight bluish tinge creeping into his lips. Within moments, the guard and a passing doctor, a young man traveling to London, arrived. They attempted to revive Mr. Redfern, checking for breath and pulse, but the attempt was short-lived and unsuccessful. "I'm afraid," the doctor said gravely, "this gentleman is dead." The words swept through the carriage like a cold wind. Miss Hawley covered her mouth, trembling. Mr. Crowthorne muttered something about heart conditions. The carriage attendant looked pale and bewildered. Miss Marple, her gaze soft but alert, surveyed the scene carefully. Her eyes fell upon the fallen teacup, positioned on the left side of the small table. She narrowed her eyes slightly. She had noticed earlier that Mr. Redfern had used his right hand for everything, lifting his briefcase, holding his newspaper, breaking his scone. A right-handed man did not suddenly switch sides for no reason. It was a very small detail, but Miss Marple lived in a world where small details often mattered most. The guard decided to halt the train at the next station, Marlacombe, so authorities could be summoned. The passengers remained in a state of shock as the train slowed and finally pulled into the station with a long, sorrowful hiss of steam. News spread rapidly as station staff hurried to assist. People gathered on the platform, murmuring amongst themselves. The doctor gave his account, and the guard attempted to control the swelling crowd. Inspector Graves, a tall, crisp man with sandy hair, arrived soon after with two. He listened to the initial reports, inspected the body, and exchanged a few quiet words with the doctor. "Cause appears to be sudden collapse," the inspector said. "Possibly cardiac failure." "That may be," Miss Marple said gently, stepping forward. "But I believe, Inspector, that you should examine the teacup. There is something a trifle odd about it." Inspector Graves regarded her with polite caution. "And you are?" "Jane Marple," she said calmly, "of St. Mary Mead." Something in her tone, quiet but assured, made the inspector pause. "I see. And what, may I ask, is odd about it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with mild apology. "Only that the gentleman seemed distinctly right-handed, and yet," she gestured toward the cup, "his tea has been placed on the left." The inspector raised an eyebrow. It was, admittedly, the sort of detail most would overlook, but he found himself making a note of it. The guard stepped down from the carriage, whispering, "Sir, the victim's briefcase is missing." Now the inspector's expression sharpened. The murmurs grew louder. Fear crept into the air. A death on a moving train was unsettling enough. A missing briefcase suggested something far more serious. The passengers were escorted off the train to provide their statements. Miss Hawley clung to a lamppost for support, still trembling. Mr. Crowthorne puffed on a cigarette, his hands shaking ever so slightly, despite his effort to appear composed. Miss Marple watched them both, her calm gaze taking in everything: gestures, expressions, contradictions. Inspector Graves questioned the carriage attendant, who stammered in confusion. Miss Marple observed that the poor boy looked absolutely terrified, not of guilt, but of being entangled in matters far beyond his understanding. As the platform bustled with policemen, railway staff, and anxious villagers, Miss Marple stood quietly amid the commotion. She was thinking carefully, methodically, about small things: the left-placed teacup, the missing briefcase, the nervous glances exchanged between passengers, the powdered sugar stain on the victim's sleeve, the way he clutched his case during the journey. All tiny threads, but threads could form a pattern. And Miss Marple was an excellent seamstress of truth. She folded her hands neatly. Some might say this was merely an unfortunate death. Miss Marple, however, was already certain something in Carriage B had gone very, very wrong. Chapter 2. Whispers along the platform. The platform at Marlecombe Station, usually a quiet place of gentle arrivals and polite departures, had transformed into a crowded hive of murmuring voices. The sudden death on the moving train had unsettled everyone, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples in every direction. Villagers from nearby houses gathered at the edges of the platform, whispering to one another as policemen moved purposefully through the area. The passengers from Carriage B stood under the grey station canopy, still shaken by the event. A chilly breeze fluttered the hem of Miss Marple's coat, but her attention remained fixed on the group. Inspector Graves had cordoned off the carriage, and 2 constables guarded the entrance. From within, the faint outline of Mr. Redfern's form could still be seen through the frosted glass. Miss Marple thought it a pity how swiftly death made one anonymous, from a man with a purpose and a destination to a silent figure watched at a respectful distance. Mr. Lionel Crowthorne, the solicitor, stood apart from the others, repeatedly smoothing the front of his waistcoat. His expression had shifted from feigned hardiness to a thin-lipped tension. His eyes darted between passengers, constables, and the inspector, as though calculating every movement. Miss Edith Halley, slender and pale, sat on a wooden bench with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked ill with shock, her eyes red from unshed tears. Miss Marple took note not only of her fear, but of the way she kept glancing toward the tracks, as though expecting something or someone. The gossip began at once. Whisper turned to speculation, speculation to rumor, rumor to bold assertion. "He looked quite healthy when he boarded," said a woman in a knitted shawl. "I heard he was involved in business troubles," murmured another. "Perhaps it was poison," someone whispered dramatically. Miss Marple listened, expression mild, but every word tucked quietly away. Inspector Graves called the passengers forward one by one, speaking with the brisk efficiency of a man who disliked disorder. Miss Marple admired that quality in him. However, she suspected he preferred straightforward cases with clear culprits. "This business will be wrapped up soon enough," he muttered to a constable as he prepared his notebook. Miss Marple's lips tightened ever so slightly. Life, she had learned, rarely arranged itself so Lionel Crowthorne was the first to be interviewed. He stepped forward with exaggerated calm, offering a polite smile that seemed to practice your movements during the journey. Inspector Graves asked. "I remained in my seat for the entire duration," Crowthorne replied smoothly. Reading a legal brief, "I hardly noticed anything out of the ordinary until that dreadful collapse." Miss Marple watched quietly from a distance. She remembered quite distinctly seeing Mr. Crowthorne standing in the corridor during the ride, speaking in low tones near the rear door. His claim of remaining seated was therefore untrue, and untruth, in Miss Marple's experience, was rarely innocent. Next came Miss Edith Halley. Her voice trembled as she answered the inspector's questions. I was just looking out the window. I didn't see anything. I heard a clink behind me, but it could have been anything. I don't know. What sort of clink? The inspector pressed. A small one? She said helplessly. Like metal on glass, perhaps. I didn't look. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. That was interesting. Something metallic, something brief, very likely connected to the moment before the collapse. The carriage attendant, James Linton, was next. He looked so frightened that he could barely stand still. The doctor thinks the man took ill, he stammered. That's all I know, sir. I only serve the tea. Did you leave your trolley unattended at any moment? No, sir. I don't think so. Only for a second or two when I stepped aside to let passengers pass. Miss Marple noted this with care. 2 seconds could be quite enough for someone determined and prepared. But James Linton's terror looked painfully sincere. A boy overwhelmed by circumstances, not a calculating criminal. When the first round of questioning concluded, Inspector Graves approached Miss Marple. His expression held a curious blend of courtesy and bafflement. You mentioned something about the teacup, he said. Something concerning handedness. Miss Marple inclined her head. Merely that the deceased gentleman appeared. He used his right hand consistently, newspaper, scone, even adjusting his spectacles. Yet the cup was placed on the left side. It struck me as unusual. Graves frowned. Could be nothing. It could, Miss Marple agreed, but I've often found that human beings stick to their habits even in the most unexpected circumstances. The inspector made a reluctant note. A constable approached. Sir, the briefcase. Inspector Graves stiffened. Found. The constable shook his head. No, sir. Thorough search of the carriage and platform. No sign of it. Miss Marple's eyes softened with concern. A missing briefcase, especially one guarded so protectively by Mr. Redfern during the journey, was no insignificant matter. She recalled how he shifted it closer each time someone passed. What do we know of Mr. Redfern? Graves asked. One of the clerks from Willowbrook, who had come running when news spread, answered hesitantly. He was tied up in investments. Some say he was dealing with disputes. Money owed. Money missing. Graves grimaced. So this may not be a simple collapse after all. Miss Marple did not say, I told you so. She merely folded her hands. As the inspector dug deeper, the villagers grew more restless. Groups formed and reformed across the platform, each eager to outdo the other in speculation. I heard he fainted before on the train last month. Heart trouble, one woman claimed. But what about the briefcase? Another whispered, lost luggage? Nothing more. Oh, no, said a man knowingly. That solicitor fellow was acting very odd. Mark my words. Edith Halley looked terrified. What does she know? It's poison, I tell you. Poison in the tea? Miss Marple, standing quietly near the ticket office, felt a familiar tug of sadness. People so rarely understood one another truly. In minutes, they could invent motives, assign guilt, and weave entire stories from fragments. Yet somewhere among the gossip, truth always left its faint trace, and Miss Marple, who had untangled many such traces in her lifetime, listened patiently. She overheard one particularly revealing remark from a porter. That gentleman boarded at Rose Hill, didn't he? He seemed in a dreadful hurry. Rose Hill. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. The poison, if poison it was, might have been administered before he even boarded. The platform clock chimed the hour. Everything felt suddenly sharper, like pieces shifting subtly into place. Inspector Graves finally dismissed the passengers with instructions to remain available for further questioning. One by one, they drifted away. Mr. Crowthorne walking swiftly toward the exit. Miss Hawley, lingering anxiously, James Linton, practically fleeing in fear of his own shadow. Miss Marple remained for a moment longer, looking back at Carriage B. The windows glinted dully in the fading afternoon light. A place of journeys, conversations, trivialities, and, for one unfortunate man, death. She considered everything she had observed: the misplaced teacup, the missing briefcase, the sugar stain on the victim's sleeve, Miss Hale's nervous clink, the false alibi, the hurried boarding at Rose Hill. They were scattered clues, faint and seemingly disconnected, yet Miss Marple felt certain they belonged to a single pattern. She stepped off the platform with measured calm. This was no accident, and very soon the quiet English countryside would discover that murder, even on a moving train, left footprints in the smallest of places. Chapter 3: Early Clues and Contradictions. The following morning dawned cold and faintly misty, with a pale sun struggling through thin clouds over St. Mary Mead. Sparrows hopped energetically along Miss Marple's garden wall, and the distant church bell rang with its customary cheer. Everything in the village appeared perfectly ordinary, which, in Miss Marple's experience, often meant that something decidedly wasn't. She had returned home the previous day feeling unsettled, though her face revealed none of it. One learned, over the years, that outward composure helped one see far more than panic ever could. Now, after a brief breakfast, she settled herself near the fire with a notepad, though she wrote nothing on it. She merely looked into the flame, thinking. The image of Mr. Redfern's still form, his cup placed strangely to the left, kept returning to her. And that missing briefcase, a piece far too important to be considered trivial. Before she could continue her contemplation, the doorbell rang. When she opened it, Inspector Graves stood on her step, hat in hand. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, sounding more courteous than the day before. "May I trouble you for a few minutes?" "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "Do come in." Graves stepped inside, looking around the neatly arranged sitting room with mild surprise. Perhaps he had expected something old-fashioned or cluttered. Instead, he found an orderly room filled with little signs of careful observation, letters sorted into tiny boxes, flowers arranged with deliberate symmetry, and maps of the village pinned under glass. Miss Marple gestured to an armchair. "I imagine you have news." Graves sat and sighed. "Some, though not much of the sort I'd prefer. The doctor's preliminary assessment yesterday was heart failure, but this morning we've ruled that out. The laboratory found traces of a toxic compound in the victim's bloodstream. So it was poison," Miss Marple murmured softly. Graves leaned back. "Indeed. And now I find myself with more questions than answers." Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "Then perhaps we can sort through them together." And together they began. Inspector Graves opened his notebook and flipped to the statements collected from passengers and staff. "I've been reviewing the accounts," he said, "and something is bothering me. The solicitor, Mr. Lionel Crowthorne, insists he remained in his seat the entire journey." Miss Marple nodded. "That is certainly what he said. But 3 different witnesses, without speaking to one another, first reported seeing him standing in the corridor during the passage through the tunnel." Miss Marple lifted her eyebrows slightly, though not in surprise. "Human beings do lie, Inspector, sometimes for the smallest reasons: pride, fear, or merely the desire to appear above suspicion." Graves scratched his chin. "But why lie about something so trivial?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is exactly why the lie may prove important." He continued, flipping pages. Miss Edith Hawley claimed she heard a metallic clink behind her just before the collapse. She was quite shaken. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. remembering Edith's trembling hands on the platform. She seemed not merely frightened, but frightened of someone. That can make people hesitant. Graves sighed. As for the carriage attendant, young James Linton, the lad is terrified. He swears he didn't tamper with anything, but a small vial of sedatives was found in his locker. Miss Marple shook her head. If the boy had poisoned anyone intentionally, Inspector, he would not tremble so, and he would not leave incriminating evidence in such a foolish place. That sort of mistake belongs to youth, but youth, I think, in fear rather than guilt. Graves frowned. Perhaps, but the evidence is there, or placed there, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Graves paused. His fingers tightened around his notebook. You think someone is framing him? It would not be the first time a frightened criminal sought the easiest scapegoat, she said. Young men in uniform are, sadly, often convenient. The room fell quiet. Outside, a sparrow chirped loudly, as if adding its own commentary to the matter. Graves turned a page. Now, about Mr. Albert Redfern. You said you remembered seeing him guard his briefcase rather protectively. Yes, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. He shifted it every time someone passed too near. The inspector nodded. We've now confirmed he was involved in a financial matter, some sort of scheme being investigated by London authorities. There were disputes, allegations of mismanagement, missing funds. Several people had reason to wish him inconvenienced. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And the briefcase contained documents, I presume. We believe so. That's why its disappearance concerns me deeply. Miss Marple considered this. If someone wished to stop Mr. Redfern from reaching London, one method would be to poison him before the journey. But if they needed the documents as well, they would have to ensure access to the briefcase after his death. But how? Graves asked. Would the killer take the briefcase on the train? Not necessarily, Miss Marple replied. There are ways to dispose of objects from a moving train. The window frames allow it, if one is determined. Graves looked up sharply. You believe the briefcase was thrown from the train? Miss Marple smiled mildly. I only suggest that the scratch on the window frame of Carriage B should not be dismissed. The inspector blinked. He had not yet heard about the scratch. Miss Marple had noticed it during the commotion the previous day, but had not had the chance to mention it. Graves shot to his feet. A scratch on the window frame. Why didn't Miss Marple raised an apologetic hand? Forgive me, Inspector. Yesterday was rather chaotic, and I feared I might be mistaken, but it was a deep scratch, as if something metal had been pressed through the opening. Graves exhaled. This changes things. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It often does. Inspector Graves sat back down, visibly more determined. We also learned that Mr. Redfern boarded at Rosehill in a great hurry, according to one station porter. Miss Marple nodded. That is important. Why? Rosehill is only one stop before Willowbrook. Exactly, Miss Marple replied. A hurried boarding often means a hurried departure. If someone administered poison at Rosehill, perhaps even moments before he boarded, the window of opportunity becomes very limited. It suggests planning. Graves took notes rapidly. So you believe the poison was administered before the journey began? Possibly, Miss Marple said, or just as he entered the carriage, but not during the ride, I think, unless someone very clever managed it unnoticed. The inspector sighed. Everything seems to point in conflicting directions. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Conflicting clues simply mean that different people may be telling different stories. He looked at her sharply. Including our passengers. Including everyone, Miss Marple said gently. Truth, Inspector. rarely travels neatly. It tends to hide among the small details others dismiss. Her tone was light, but her meaning was clear. This was no ordinary case. After the inspector left, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching him walk briskly down the lane. The mist was lifting. The sun had broken through at last, casting a soft golden light over the garden. She could hear the distant clatter of the milk cart and the murmur of daily life resuming, yet in her mind, the murder on the moving train remained as vivid as ever. She reviewed the details once more. Quietly, methodically, Mr. Crowthorne's false alibi, Edith Hale's mysterious clink, the anxious glances exchanged on the train, the missing briefcase, the scratch on the window, the poison found in Mr. Redfern's system, the hurried boarding at Roselle. All distinct pieces, all important. Slowly, the shape of something began to form, not a full solution, certainly not yet, but the faint outline of a pattern. Miss Marple had learned long ago that human nature repeated itself endlessly. If one understood people, their motives, their fears, and desires, one could often see the truth long before the facts aligned neatly. She closed her notebook, still blank, and placed it gently upon the table. This would not be a simple case of a sudden collapse. This was murder, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and gentle persistence, had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Convenient Suspect. The news of the poisoning spread through Willowbrook and the surrounding villages faster than the milk cart on its morning route. By the next noon, every shopkeeper, every gardener, every church volunteer seemed to have formed a private conclusion, and every conclusion was different. Some believed it was a crime of passion, others insisted it must have been a business dispute, while a few adopted the rather dramatic view that Mr. Redfern had been involved in terrible secret dealings with mysterious strangers. Miss Marple heard much of this from her neighbor, Mrs. Penn, who had arrived with a basket of scones and the unmistakable hunger for fresh information. "You were in the carriage, Miss Marple," Mrs. Penberry said, lowering her voice. "Surely you saw something. The whole village says it was definitely poison." Miss Marple accepted the scones politely. "One should not jump to conclusions. My dear, poison is a possibility, of course, but so is carelessness in handling a pharmaceutical substance. Many household items can cause damage if used unwisely." Mrs. Penberry shook her head firmly. "No, no. This was deliberate. Inspector Graves has arrested the carriage attendant, hasn't he? James Linton." Miss Marple looked at her neighbor with a gentle steadiness. "Rumors are rather quick things, Mrs. Penn, faster than trains. But it's true, isn't it?" Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Inspector Graves is certainly questioning young Linton, but questioning is not the same as arresting." And she sincerely hoped the boy was not arrested, because something in her heart told her the lad was frightened. Yes, confused and overwhelmed. Yes, but not wicked. Mrs. Penberry left soon after, disappointed in Miss Marple's refusal to feed the flames of gossip. But Miss Marple was thinking of something else entirely. The look on James Linton's face, the trembling of his hands, and the unmistakable terror that had shadowed his every answer. Not the terror of guilt, the terror of a boy caught in a net someone else had cast. Inspector Graves arrived in St. Mary Mead that afternoon, his face set in a firm expression of authority. Miss Marple could see at once that he had made up his mind, or believed he had. "I'm afraid I must speak plainly," he began once. Miss Marple had shown him into the sitting room. "We have reason to believe the carriage attendant, James Linton, administered the poison." Miss Marple folded her hands. "On what grounds, Inspector?" "The sleeping draught found in his locker," Graves replied briskly, "and access to the tea service." "Yes, quite," Miss Marple said gently. but many people had access to tea that morning. The trolley was passed through the carriage, and vials can be placed in lockers easily, especially when the owner is young and inexperienced. Graves frowned. You're suggesting someone planted the evidence? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said delicately, that fear can make the guilty behave cleverly and the innocent behave poorly. The inspector bristled slightly. The boy has no alibi. He cannot account for every moment before the collapse. Most people cannot, Miss Marple responded, her voice soft. If you asked me exactly what I did with every second of this morning, I should likely stumble as well. Graves tightened his jaw. Nevertheless, he had motive. What motive? A recent reprimand, Graves said. Apparently, Mr. Redfern complained about him some weeks ago. The railway staff confirmed it. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. A reprimand? A mild professional complaint? Hardly the fuel for murder, Inspector. Graves looked irritated. You underestimate how resentment grows in young, hot-headed men. Miss Marple smiled kindly. And you perhaps overestimate how often murder is committed by them. Graves stood. Regardless, he had opportunity, access, and questionable behavior. Miss Marple rose as well. And yet, she said softly, the truth rarely aligns itself so neatly with the easiest suspect. Graves paused at the door. Are you saying I'm wrong? I would never presume to say that, Miss Marple said with gentle diplomacy. I merely encourage you to consider that convenient answers are not always correct ones. When the inspector left, Miss Marple returned to her seat with a thoughtful sigh. James Linton was being drawn into the spotlight, and someone, somewhere, was glad of it. Miss Marple decided that her next step must be a quiet one. In her experience, information could be obtained more easily when one appeared harmless, curious, or politely confused. She therefore took the mid-afternoon bus to Marlacombe and walked across the station yard to the railway office, where the station master, Mr. Wilfred Hardy, presided with a tidy desk and a neat mustache. Miss Marple! Mr. Hardy exclaimed with surprise. What brings you here? Oh, nothing of importance, she said pleasantly. I merely wanted to inquire whether anything was found during yesterday's search of the platform. Something that may have been dropped, perhaps. Mr. Hardy frowned thoughtfully. Nothing belonging to passengers. No. But we did find a torn strip of leather caught in the hedgerow beside the track. Leather? Yes. Stiff. Dark. Like from a briefcase, perhaps. Torn clean through, as though it were snagged and yanked violently. Miss Marple felt a small tightening in her chest. May I see it? He retrieved it from his drawer. Miss Marple held the strip carefully. The edges were frayed sharply, as though the case had been forced against something hard or pulled through a narrow space, like a train window. And any sign of the briefcase itself? She asked. No, nothing. We expect it may have been thrown further down the line. Miss Marple thanked him warmly and stepped back onto the platform. The scratch on the window frame, the missing briefcase, and now the torn leather. The pattern grew clearer. Someone had removed the briefcase from the train, and someone wanted James Linton to be blamed. On her way back, Miss Marple passed the small tea shop opposite the station. Through the window, she spotted Miss Edith Halley, the young woman from the carriage, seated alone at a corner table with a cup of tea. Her hands were shaking so visibly that Miss Marple's heart softened at once. She entered quietly. My dear, may I join you? Edith looked up, startled. Miss Marple, oh, yes, please, Miss Marple said, smoothing her gloves. Yesterday must have been quite distressing. Edith nodded quickly. I can't stop thinking about it. You heard a clink? Miss Marple said gently. Something metallic. Edith bit her lip. Yes, I didn't mean to hear it. It was just behind me when the train went into the tunnel. A sharp sound, and Mr. Crowthorne was standing near the door. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Are you afraid of something? Edith hesitated, then whispered, Yes. Someone was watching me yesterday. After we got off the train. Who? I don't know. But Mr. Crowthorne kept staring, and when I left the platform, someone followed me for a few steps. Miss Marple reached across the table, touching the girl's hand gently. You must be careful, my dear, and you must tell Inspector Graves exactly what you told me. Edith's eyes widened. I'm afraid, too. Courage, Miss Halley, Miss Marple said softly. Truth can be frightening, but it is far less dangerous than silence. As Miss Marple left the tea shop, her mind was calm despite the growing complexity of the case. James Linton was the easy suspect. Too easy, but Mr. Crowthorne's lie. The torn leather strip, Edith Hale's fear, the clink behind her seat, and the missing briefcase painted a far more intricate picture. As she walked toward the bus stop, she paused to look down the railway tracks, stretching into the distance. A moving train could hide many things. A quick exchange, a forced window, a tossed object, a carefully timed movement in a tunnel. But it could not hide human nature. Miss Marple folded her hands. The convenient suspect was not the true one, and the real killer, clever, desperate, and watching, had made their first mistake. She wondered calmly, would they make another? Chapter 5. Shadows Behind Redfern's Life. The next morning, Miss Marple was pruning the roses in her garden when she heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path. She looked up to see Inspector Graves accompanied by a tall, neatly dressed man with a leather portfolio under his arm. Miss Marple, Graves said, may we trouble you again? Of course. Inspector, she replied warmly, do come in out of the wind. The morning seems to be arguing with the season. Inside the sitting room, the inspector introduced the visitor. This is Mr. Henry Walcott, clerk with the London Financial Office investigating Mr. Redfern's dealings. Miss Marple nodded politely. How unfortunate that your work should bring you here under such circumstances. Walcott sat stiffly, his jaw tight. Unfortunate, indeed. Miss Marple, we had been expecting Mr. Redfern yesterday for a rather important meeting. You can imagine our alarm when we received news of his death? Inspector Graves folded his arms. You implied in your message that Redfern was in trouble. Serious trouble. Walcott let out a breath. Mr. Redfern was heading toward legal disaster. He had tampered with client funds, a matter that would have cost him his business and perhaps his freedom. He had enemies, many. Miss Marple listened attentively. Enemies often gather around money matters, she said softly. Human nature is remarkably consistent in that regard. Yes, Walcott continued. We also discovered that Redfern was blackmailing someone, a solicitor. He was threatening to expose him unless paid a sizable sum within the week. Inspector Graves leaned forward. The name? Walcott hesitated. Lionel Crewthorne. Miss Marple felt a quiet tightening in her chest. It was not shock, merely confirmation of something already suspected. Crowthorne Graves muttered. He was on the train, and, Miss Marple added gently, he lied about never leaving his seat. The room fell into a hush. Miss Marple's eyes, calm but bright, fixed on the inspector. Perhaps, she said, we should look more closely at Mr. Crowthorne's affairs. That afternoon, Inspector Graves requested Miss Marple's company as he reviewed the collected testimonies. Though he would never have admitted it aloud, he found her quiet intelligence unsettlingly accurate. They sat in the station master's office at Marley Combe, where the smell of ink and paper filled the air. Graves read aloud from the notes. Redfern dismissed Edith Hale's brother from his firm months ago. Some say unjustly. Edith herself seems terrified of something. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. Fear is often the first revealing thread. Then we have this, Graves continued. A letter received from a client claiming Redfern meant to expose a fraudulent investment scheme involving local residents. Miss Marple considered this. One scheme, many victims. Anger breeds quickly in small places. Graves tapped his pen. But anger isn't enough. We need means and opportunity. And cunning, Miss Marple added, for this crime required both. The inspector turned another page. Then there's Crowthorne, now linked to blackmail. He had the strongest reason to silence Redfern, and he attempted to present himself as entirely uninvolved, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. A nervous man often talks too much. A guilty man often talks too little. Graves snorted. He talked enough. Too confidently. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Confidence can be a performance. The inspector sat back, rubbing his temples. What of the briefcase? If it contained documents proving his misconduct, then removing it, Miss Marple finished softly, was essential. There was a pause. Graves looked up sharply. You believe the killer removed it? I believe, Miss Marple replied gently, that someone pushed it through the window. The torn leather you found suggests as much. And the scratch on the frame, Graves muttered. Yes, she nodded. That briefcase did not vanish. It was made to vanish. At Graves's request, Lionel Crowthorne was summoned to Marlacombe Station for additional questioning. Miss Marple attended as a quiet observer, though Graves suspected she saw more in a minute than most men saw in an hour. Crowthorne entered with the strained confidence of someone who believed he had prepared for every possibility. But Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand when he removed his gloves. Mr. Crowthorne, Graves began, we've learned Mr. Redfern intended to expose you for financial misconduct. The solicitor froze for a fraction of a second, barely a blink, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. That is absurd, Crowthorne said sharply. Redfern was grasping at straws. The man was failing. He was desperate. And you were not? Miss Marple asked softly. Crowthorne's head jerked toward her. I beg your pardon. She smiled mildly. Financial strain can be quite distressing. The solicitor's jaw clenched. My affairs are entirely my own concern. Indeed, Miss Marple said gently, and yet Mr. Redfern seemed to think otherwise. Inspector Graves cut in. Did you leave your seat at any point during the journey? Crowthorne's face stiffened. No, I saw you, Miss Marple said quietly. Standing in the corridor during the tunnel, you were whispering with someone. Crowthorne's composure cracked for an instant. A sharp inhale, a flash of panic, before he smoothed his expression. You're mistaken, he said coldly. In these chaotic moments, memory can play tricks. Miss Marple looked at him kindly, though her voice remained firm. A lifetime of observing people, Mr. Crowthorne, has taught me that memory rarely falters in simple matters. Graves leaned forward. Where did you stand during the tunnel? Edith Hale sat, trembling on a bench, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers. Miss Marple approached her gently. My dear, you seem tired. These days must be very trying for you. Edith nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. My brother, he worked for Mr. Redfern. He lost everything when he was dismissed. I thought perhaps people might blame us. Truth rarely considers family misfortune as guilt, Miss Marple said kindly. Edith swallowed hard. I keep wondering, did Mr. Redfern deserve it? Did he do something terrible? I heard him say something once about ruining someone's life. Miss Marple leaned in. Do you remember who he was speaking to? Edith hesitated. Mr. Cross. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but sharpened with inward interest. And did you see or hear anything else during the journey? Edith closed her eyes, reliving the moment when the train went dark in the tunnel. Someone shifted behind me. I heard a sharp clink. Metal, glass. Then Mr. Crowthorne hurried away toward the rear door. And after the train stopped? Miss Marple asked softly. Edith whispered, I felt someone watching me. Miss Marple squeezed her hand reassuringly. You must not blame yourself for what you saw or overheard. It is often the innocent witness who carries the greatest burden. Edith's shoulders shook slightly. She clutched her handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. Miss Marple left the station with a clear, steady impression. The shadows around Mr. Redfern's death stretched far beyond a moment on a train. They reached into disputes, betrayals, financial desperation, and human fear. James Linton remained under suspicion, but Miss Marple knew in her bones he was not the killer. The evidence against him was too convenient, too tidy, like a stage set arranged for an audience. But the real story was unfolding elsewhere. Lionel Crowthorne, with his fragile confidence and simmering panic, was hiding something. Edith Hale's terror suggested more was whispered in that carriage than anyone had realized. And Mr. Redfern's briefcase, now torn, missing, and likely tossed from the train, was the most telling clue of all. As evening fell upon St. Mary Mead, and lamps glowed warmly in cottage windows, Miss Marple sat in her chair, gently tapping one finger on the armrest. The pattern was forming, dark threads weaving into a design, and Miss Marple knew this design would reveal something quite unsettling. The killer was clever, but human nature, she reflected with quiet certainty, was always more predictable than the cleverest criminal believed. Chapter 6. The Missing Briefcase. The next day dawned with a curious brightness, the sort that made every leaf in St. Mary Mead glisten with an almost eager shine. Miss Marple, however, felt none of the morning's cheer. Her thoughts remained on the railway carriage, the scratch on the window frame, the torn strip of leather, and the increasingly troubling behavior of Lionel Crowthorne. She was expecting a visitor, and not one from the police. Her nephew, Raymond's wife, Joan, had telephoned that morning to say she was passing through the village and wished to stop by for tea. Joan arrived promptly at 11, dressed smartly, her gloved hands folded neatly around a small parcel. Just some biscuits for you, Aunt Jane, she said warmly, taking a seat by the window. Raymond says he's certain you're keeping yourself busy with something mysterious. Miss Marple gave a modest smile. Raymond always imagines excitement where there is usually only a bit of gardening or parish matters. Oh, come now, Joan laughed. I know you better than that. Every time something unusual happens in St. Mary Mead, you're somehow involved. Miss Marple poured tea, quietly, grateful for her niece's lively company. Joan sipped thoughtfully. I heard about the man who died on the train. Terrible business. It is, Miss Marple agreed softly, and not as simple as it seemed at first. Joan leaned forward. So it was foul play. Miss Marple placed her cup gently onto its saucer. One must never speak too boldly before understanding the pieces. But yes, there is every likelihood the poor man was poisoned, and more troubling still, his briefcase is missing. Joan's brows lifted. Missing. Stolen. Why? For its contents, Miss Marple said, almost certainly. Joan shook her head slowly. It always astonishes me how wickedness can hide in plain daylight. Miss Marple nodded. Human beings rarely hide their worst qualities in the shadows. More often, they disguise them in politeness, routine, and familiarity. Joan sat back. Well, Raymond's right about one thing. You do seem busy. Miss Marple only smiled faintly. Her mind was already on the railway tracks again. That afternoon, as Miss Marple was tidying up after tea, Inspector Graves appeared at her door, looking unusually grave. Miss Marple, he said, without preamble, we've found something. She motioned him inside. Please, Inspector, do sit. What has happened? Graves removed his hat. A farm boy from Marleycombe came to us this morning. He found a large object half buried near a hedgerow, about a mile from the tracks. Miss Marple's heart tightened. The briefcase, yes, Graves confirmed. But it had been forced open. Documents missing. Only fragments of paper remained inside, and those were torn beyond recognition. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though inwardly she felt the gravity of the revelation settling deeply. Then we must assume, she said quietly, that whoever took the briefcase had a very clear purpose. Graves nodded. The farm boy also brought us something else, the metal clasp of the briefcase. Torn off completely, Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. That would require considerable force. Exactly, Graves said, which means it was likely pushed or pulled through the train window, just as you suspected. Miss Marple's eyes softened with a thoughtful glimmer. It confirms, Inspector, that the murder was not impulsive. It was prepared, possibly rehearsed. Graves blew out a breath. That's what troubles me. Whoever did it planned for almost every detail except the witnesses. Someone saw Crowthorne moving during the tunnel. Someone had a clink. Human nature always leaves traces, Miss Marple murmured. Graves rubbed his forehead. There's more. The boy who found the briefcase said he saw someone walking along the tracks the evening of the murder. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. He thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That detail, Inspector, is not nothing. Graves nodded. I know, and only 2 passengers matched that height and build. Mr. Crowthorne, Miss Marple said quietly, and Mr. Lionel Crow. The inspector gave her a tight, humorless smile. Precisely. Inspector Graves asked Miss Marple if she would accompany him for a second examination of Carriage B. She agreed, though her steps were slower than usual as they crossed the station yard. A sense of sadness settled over her. Not from fatigue, but from the realization that the railway carriage would forever hold a memory of the poor man's final moments. Carriage B stood empty and roped off, its quiet interior bearing no trace of the bustling passengers from 2 days earlier. Miss Marple stepped inside with a gentle reverence. The window where she had noticed the scratch remained unchanged. Inspector Graves approached it, running his thumb along the groove. You are right, he said. This was caused by something sharp under pressure. Miss Marple leaned closer, and the angle of the scratch suggests the object was pulled outward. Graves nodded. The briefcase. Precisely, Miss Marple whispered, and likely thrown from the train after the tunnel, where few would notice. The inspector frowned. But why throw it? Why not hide it inside the train? Because, Miss Marple said gently, inside the train, anyone might stumble upon it, but a hedgerow along the tracks. One might hope it would remain undiscovered, or at least long enough to destroy the evidence. Graves sighed heavily. Whoever planned this knew the route well. They knew where the train slowed. They knew the tunnel's timing. The killer was familiar with that line, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Perhaps someone who traveled it often, or someone from the area. Graves shot her a meaningful look. Crowthorne commutes regularly between Willowbrook and London. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. She moved toward the seat where Mr. Redfern had collapsed. She studied the small table, running her fingertip lightly across the surface. His teacup fell here, she murmured, but he was right-handed. Why was it placed on the left? Graves shrugged. Maybe he switched hands. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. Human habits remain consistent even in stress. The placement was deliberate. Someone needed him to reach with his left hand at that particular moment. Graves looked at her sharply. Why? Miss Marple lowered her voice. To ensure he grasped the poisoned cup, not the safe one. When they left the carriage, Inspector Graves informed Miss Marple that Edith Halley had been asked to come to the station for additional questioning. Miss Marple requested permission to speak with her before the inspector did. Edith arrived shortly after, her coat buttoned up to her chin, eyes wide with worry. She seemed smaller somehow, as though fear had taken something from her posture. Miss Marple approached her with maternal gentleness. My dear, you must not be afraid. You did nothing wrong. Edith swallowed hard. I wish I could tell you that, Miss Marple, but I'm not sure. The elderly woman took her hand. You saw something on the train, something you did not recognize as important at the time. Edith nodded. The clink, yes? Miss Marple encouraged softly. In the tunnel, it was dark. Someone moved behind me. Something metal touched the table, I think. And then Mr. Crowthorne said something quietly. I didn't hear the words, but his voice was tense. Miss Marple squeezed her hand, and afterward, Edith's voice dropped to a whisper. I felt someone follow me when I left the platform. I hurried home. I didn't look back. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Fear is quite natural, my dear. But fear also means you noticed something someone wishes you hadn't. Edith shivered. Do you think someone would harm me? Miss Marple gave her hand a firm hold. Not if we're careful. And I believe you know more than you think. After Edith left, Miss Marple remained on the station platform for a long while, watching the empty tracks disappear into the distance. In her mind, the clues arranged themselves quietly. The missing briefcase, the torn leather, the scratch on the train window, the clink in the tunnel. Crowthorne's lies, Edith Hale's fear. The hurried boarding at Rosehill, the missing documents, and James Linton, the convenient suspect, but not the correct one. A silent thread connected them all. Miss Marple knew with growing clarity. The killer had planned every detail with cold precision. They had counted on the panic of the young attendant, the chaos of the crowded carriage, the dark cover of the tunnel, and the destruction of the incriminating documents. But they had not counted on two things. One, a frightened young woman hearing a clink in the dark. Two, an elderly lady with sharp eyes and a memory for human nature. Miss Marple folded her umbrella, preparing to walk home. The murderer had slipped up. Only slightly, but enough. And Miss Marple was now very close to seeing exactly how the threads intertwined. Chapter 7. A Second Attack. The evening sky over Willowbrook blushed pink and lavender as dusk approached. Yet an unusual heaviness hung in the air. A quiet that did not feel like peace, but rather the tight stillness before a storm. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she stepped outside her cottage for her customary late afternoon. It was not the weather, nor the gathering clouds. It was something else. Her thoughts lingered on Edith Halley, whose pale face and trembling hands earlier in the day had told a story more troubling than her halting words. Fear clung to the girl like a shawl, too heavy to remove. Miss Marple recalled how Edith had admitted she watched a detail Miss Marple found impossible to ignore. Human beings Miss Marple often reflected, might lie about many things, but they rarely lie about fear. As she walked past the churchyard, the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoed from farther down the road. A figure, tall, cloaked, in dark clothing, moved swiftly along the lane toward the old footpath that led to Miss Marple stared for a moment, narrowing her eyes. The build, the posture, familiar enough to raise suspicion, though the gathering twilight made details difficult. Moments later, she heard another sound, lighter, quicker, almost breathless. She recognized it instantly. Edith Halley. Miss Marple's steps quickened. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The old footpath between Willowbrook and Marlacombe twisted through shrubs and low hedges, a narrow dirt trail that villagers seldom used after dusk. It was along this path that Miss Marple now heard unmistakable noises, the crunch of hurried steps, a sharp gasp, and then a cry of alarm. Miss Marple pressed forward, heart pounding with quiet urgency. Near the bend, where the path curved toward the railway embankment, she saw them, two figures in the half-light. Edith Halley stumbled backward, her hands raised defensively. A man's silhouette loomed over her, one arm extended as though he had tried to push her or pull her off the path. "Stop!" Miss Marple called, her voice sharp with sudden authority she rarely displayed. The man froze for the briefest second, then fled. He darted down the embankment, disappearing into the thick brush. His coat flared behind him, his hat slipped low over his face. Edith staggered, clutching Miss Marple's arm for support. He tried to push me onto the tracks," she gasped. Miss Marple guided her to the side of the path, helping her sit on a fallen log. The girl's breath came in trembling waves. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, steadying her, "you are safe now. He is gone." Edith buried her face in her hands. "I knew someone was following me. I told you. "You were quite right," Miss Marple murmured, "and I fear this confirms what we suspected." Edith lifted her head. "That I saw something I shouldn't have." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, my dear. And someone believes you saw or heard enough to endanger them." Inspector Graves arrived within 20 minutes of Miss Marple's telephone call, accompanied by Constable Finch. His expression was grim, his manner brisk. "Miss Halley," he said gently but firmly, "are you certain the man attempted to harm you?" Edith nodded vigorously. He grabbed my arm and shoved me backward. I almost fell if Miss Marple hadn't come when she did. Graves raised a hand. Yes, I understand," Miss Marple added quietly. "He fled as soon as I called out. That alone suggests guilt." Graves paced the narrow path, scanning the ground. "And he came from this direction, you say?" "Toward the railway." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, as though he had been waiting or watching. The inspector crouched beside a patch of disturbed soil. "Footprints," he muttered. "Large ones. Likely a man." Miss Marple glanced at him mildly. "Larger men are rarer in Willowbrook than smaller ones. Only a few fit that description." "Crowthorne," Graves muttered under his breath. "Certainly tall enough." Miss Marple gave a small nod, though we must not leap to conclusions. "I'm not leaping," Graves said. "I'm observing." Miss Marple hid a faint smile. A good habit, she thought, and one that Inspector Graves was finally beginning to adopt. Graves turned to Edith. "Did you see his face?" "It was dark," she whispered, "and he kept his hat low, but he wore a dark coat, long, heavy, like the one Mr. Crowthorne wore when he left the station." Graves exchanged a significant look with Miss Marple. "That settles it," the constable muttered. "No," Miss Marple corrected softly. "It merely adds weight." But evidence must always be proven, not assumed. Edith shuddered. He's trying to silence me. Because of that sound, the clink in the tunnel. Yes, Miss Marple said. You heard something connected to Mr. Redfern's death. That makes you a threat. Inspector Graves escorted Edith back to her small cottage, placing a constable outside for the night. After Edith had calmed somewhat, Miss Marple asked gently if they might speak in private. Edith agreed, trembling but determined. I didn't tell him everything, Edith said in a low voice once they were alone. I was too frightened. You may tell me anything, my dear, Miss Marple replied softly. Edith swallowed hard. In the tunnel, when the train went dark, someone brushed past me. I felt something sharp against my elbow. Like? Mita. Then I heard a soft click, like something opening or closing. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A clasp, Edith nodded. Yes. Like a latch snapping shut, Miss Marple thought immediately of the torn strip of leather and the missing clasp. And then? She asked gently. And then? Edith whispered. I heard Mr. Crowthorne whisper something. I couldn't make it out, but it sounded angry. Miss Marple's heart ached for the young woman's fear. But she also knew the value of this information. One more thing, Edith added. I didn't want to say this earlier. I was afraid you'd think I imagined it. My dear child, Miss Marple said tenderly, I have learned never to underestimate the observations of a frightened witness. Edith nodded shakily. Just before the lights came on, I heard someone breathing hard, as though they were pulling at something heavy. Miss Marple felt a small, quiet certainty settle over her. The briefcase. The killer had removed it in the darkness of the tunnel, relying on the train's shudder and noise to mask the deed. Later that night, Miss Marple walked home slowly beneath the pale gleam of the moon. The quiet village seemed peaceful once more, but Miss Marple now knew better. A killer was among them, a person intelligent enough to plan a mid-train murder, manipulate evidence, toss a briefcase unnoticed into a hedgerow, and now attempt to silence a terrified witness. But intelligence, she reminded herself, was not infallible. The pieces were fitting together. Crowthorne's financial desperation, Redfern's threat to expose him, the lies about remaining seated, the clink in the tunnel, the torn leather, the scratch on the window, the missing papers, Edith's attacker fleeing toward the railway. Miss Marple touched her gloved fingers together thoughtfully. The murderer had made a dangerous miscalculation. They believed fear would make Edith silent. Instead, fear had made her speak. As Miss Marple closed her gate behind her, she murmured softly to herself, a murderer who panics is always a murderer who errs. And now, for the first time, Miss Marple sensed she was very close to uncovering exactly who had killed Albert Redfern and how. Chapter 8. The Timetable Puzzle. The next morning arrived with a washed-out sky, pale gray clouds drifting listlessly over St. Mary Mead. Air smelled faintly of rain, though none had fallen. Miss Marple sat by her front window with her embroidery basket, which rarely contained embroidery, sipping her tea and thinking intently. The attack on Edith Halley had altered everything. A killer who merely poisoned was one thing. A killer who attempted a second crime was quite another. Desperation always betrayed itself. As she sat quietly, Miss Marple reviewed the events in her mind with methodical clarity. She pictured the railway carriage, each passenger, each movement, each detail that had seemed trivial at the time. Then she imagined the tunnel, a brief period of darkness, confusion, and noise. Yes, she murmured softly, that is when it must have happened. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Inspector Graves stood there, eyes shadowed with fatigue but sharp with determination. Miss Marple, he said, I believe we must go over the timetable together. This case refuses to make sense unless we're missing something obvious. Miss Marple smiled gently. Timetables, Inspector, rarely lie. It is people who do. Graves sighed. Then perhaps the people will become clearer once we know exactly when everything happened. Miss Marple nodded and retrieved her coat. Let us begin at the beginning. They walked together to the vicarage, where Reverend Leonard Clement had kindly prepared a long table for their use. On it lay a detailed map of the railway line, a train schedule borrowed from the station master, and notes Miss Marple had kept in her head, but would now, reluctantly, put into writing. Inspector Graves spread out the train timetable. The Willowbrook-London train left at 10:05 a.m., he began. Arrived at Rosehill at 10:11, departed at 10:13, entered the tunnel at 10:19, exited at 10:20. Mr. Redfern collapsed at 10:23. Miss Marple nodded. An efficient schedule. Now, Graves continued, witnesses placed the refreshment trolley in Carriage B at approximately 10:18, just before the tunnel. And that, Miss Marple said softly, is crucial. Graves frowned. Why? Because, she replied, any poisoning done during the trolley pass would have been observed. Too public, too risky. The killer would need the confusion of the tunnel to perform anything delicate. Graves tapped his pen, so the poison must have been added before the train entered the tunnel. Miss Marple raised a gentle finger. Or before Mr. Redfern boarded. Graves looked up sharply. Rosehill, yes, Miss Marple said. He boarded hurriedly. A man in haste is often not careful. Someone could have handed him a drink, a sweet, a small cup, anything. Or slipped poison into something he was already carrying, Graves muttered, and the murderer made sure he sat in Carriage B. Miss Marple considered this. People like Mr. Redfern, creatures of habit, sit where they always sit. Someone familiar with his routine would know that. Graves scribbled quickly, so the poison was administered either at Rosehill or moments before the tunnel, and the briefcase removed during the tunnel. Miss Marple added, yes, the darkness, the noise, the jolt of the carriage, perfect cover. Graves exhaled, so our suspect must know the line intimately, know exactly when the tunnel arrives. Miss Marple nodded. Only someone who travels often, someone who knows the rhythm of that route. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Crowthorne, the inspector said quietly. Miss Marple did not speak, but she did not disagree. With the timetable laid out, Miss Marple began to arrange small paper scraps representing each passenger, placing them where they sat or stood during the journey. Graves watched with growing admiration. You remember all this? One must, Miss Marple said modestly. Human nature hides more truth in a seating plan than one might imagine. She placed Redfern near the window, Edith Hall just 2 seats away, Crowthorne at the aisle, though he had not stayed there. Miss Marple moved his piece down the corridor. He left his seat during the tunnel. We have 3 witnesses. Graves grunted. He claims they're mistaken. Miss Marple smiled faintly. 1 witness may be mistaken. 3 are rarely mistaken about the same thing. Next, she placed the trolley in the aisle. James Linton served tea before the tunnel. His hands were shaking even then, not with guilt, but youth. Graves sighed. Yes, the boys being framed. That is my belief, Miss Marple said gently. And Edith? Graves asked, Miss Marple placed Edith's piece where the clink had been heard. She heard the removal of the briefcase, the clasp snapping shut, which explains why someone tried to silence her, Graves muttered darkly. Miss Marple continued quietly. The killer believed that if Edith were found injured or worse, suspicion would fall squarely on young Linton, who had no alibi. The inspector slammed his notebook shut. So Crowthorne planned everything: the poisoning, the removal of the briefcase, planting evidence, attempting to silence Edith. Miss Marple raised a hand. "Inspector, we must not speak the conclusion before proving it." Graves groaned. "Yes, evidence." First, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. Her voice was calm. "We have motive, opportunity, knowledge of the railway line, lies about his movements, and now an attempted second crime." Graves nodded. "And the timeline supports it." Just as they finished reviewing the timetable, Mrs. Clement entered with fresh tea and an apologetic smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Miss Marple said kindly. "You are most helpful." Mrs. Clement poured tea, then said conversationally, "You know, Inspector, my cousin in Rosehill mentioned something odd. She said a solicitor had been at the station that morning in quite a hurry." Inspector Graves straightened. "Ah, solicitor?" Mrs. Clement continued. "Yes, she didn't catch his name, but she said he looked out of sorts pacing, checking his watch. He boarded quickly, she said, just after Mr. Redfern." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "She did not need the name." Graves exhaled slowly. "So Crowthorne was at Rosehill too." Mrs. Clement blinked. "Was that important?" Miss Marple smiled warmly. "My dear, it is exactly what we needed to know." Graves leaned back. He followed Redfern to Rosehill, ensured he boarded the correct carriage, possibly administered poison there before the train even moved. Miss Marple nodded, and later, in the tunnel, removed the incriminating briefcase. The inspector's voice hardened. "We're closing in," Miss Marple whispered. "Yes, but a clever murderer panics when cornered. We must tread lightly." After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind filled with the certainty that the pattern was nearly complete. The timetable had revealed what human testimony alone could not: the mechanics of the crime, the poisoning, the tunnel, the removal of the briefcase, the attempted attack on Edith, the lies, the fear, the desperation. All of it pointed in one direction. Yet Miss Marple knew that naming a murderer was not enough. One needed proof, undeniable proof, and a way to expose the truth without danger to the innocent. As she paused outside her gate, Miss Marple murmured softly, "The next step must be taken with care." The killer was watching. The killer was panicking, and a panicking killer was the most dangerous kind. Miss Marple lifted her chin, her eyes sharp despite her gentle appearance. It was time to set the bait, time to draw the murderer into the open, and Miss Marple, with the quiet precision of a chess master, was already planning her next move. Chapter 9. The final trap begins. The next morning dawned soft and blue, with thin sunlight filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room. She had slept little, rising before dawn to prepare what she considered her most delicate task yet. Murder, she knew, was rarely solved through confrontation or force. It required a different approach, one of quiet patience and a subtle touch. She set a tray of tea and scones near the hearth. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had helped arrange the invitations. No one suspected anything unusual. When villagers received an invitation from Jane Marple for afternoon tea, they assumed, quite reasonably, that they were being welcomed to polite conversation. But this tea would serve a different purpose. At precisely 3 o'clock, the first knock sounded at her door. Miss Edith Halley stood on the threshold, pale but composed. Her hands trembled slightly, but she had dressed neatly and pinned her hair back. She gave Miss Marple a shy nod before stepping inside. You are safe here, my dear, Miss Marple assured her, leading her to a comfortable chair by the window. Edith whispered, "Are the others coming?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "It is necessary." Edith swallowed hard. "Will he be angry?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "Truth tends to make the guilty quite uncomfortable. But anger is only the mask of fear, my dear." Edith said nothing, but her eyes glimmered with hesitant trust. Another knock came firmer this time. Miss Marple opened the door to Inspector Graves and Constable Finch. They stepped inside without ceremony, though Graves gave a slight bow to Miss Halley, acknowledging her bravery. A third knock arrived shortly after, sharp, decisive, and practiced. Lionel Krausong. Miss Marple welcomed him warmly. "Mr. Kraushorn, how kind of you to attend." He removed his hat stiffly. "I hope there is some purpose to this gathering, Miss Marple. I am rather occupied these days." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh yes, I assure you, the purpose will become quite clear." Behind him, Miss Marple saw the faintest flicker of unsettled unease. Her trap was set. Once everyone was seated, Miss Marple poured tea, moving with her customary. She chatted lightly about weather in the garden, speaking of roses soon to bloom, of blackbirds nesting near the gate, of the new curate's enthusiastic sermons. Everything about the scene suggested nothing more than a gentle afternoon gathering. But underneath the harmless conversation, an invisible tension threaded through the room. Lionel Crowthorne sat rigidly, his eyes flicking occasionally toward Edith Haley, who refused to look in his direction. Inspector Graves observed both of them quietly, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple passed the plate of scones with a serene smile. "Do have a scone, Mr. Crowthorne. Freshly baked." He accepted one reluctantly. His fingers tapped the saucer nervously. Miss Marple took her own cup and sat back comfortably. "It is a curious thing," she said lightly, "how objects sometimes reappear when least expected." Crowthorne paused, mid-sip. "Objects, yes," Miss Marple replied, her tone airy. "One might think something is lost forever, and then quite suddenly, it turns up, sometimes with interesting traces upon it." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Very interesting traces." Edith Hawley stiffened. She understood. Crowthorne's expression tightened. "Are you referring to something specific, Miss Marple?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said with gentle certainty. "To Mr. Redfern's briefcase?" Crowthorne's hand jerked slightly, but he quickly masked the movement with a cough. "You found the briefcase?" he demanded. Inspector Graves answered calmly. "It was discovered near the tracks. The farmer's boy who found it handed it over." Crowthorne paled. And its contents?" "Mostly destroyed," Graves said. "But the clasp remained. And that clasp, Mr. Crowthorne, bears fingerprints." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "You see, fingerprints are quite stubborn things. They do not vanish simply because paper does." Crowthorne's composure cracked for a brief second. His jaw tightened. His breathing quickened. Then he forced a smile. "This is absurd. You cannot possibly think," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Oh, but I do think, Mr. Crowthorne. What I think is that you removed the briefcase in the tunnel, forced it through the window, and left its torn leather behind." Edith Halley let out a small gasp. Inspector Graves rose slightly from his chair, watching Crowthorne with hawk-like precision. Crowthorne stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. I refuse to sit here and listen to unfounded accusations." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Sit down, please." It was not a command, but Crowthorne sat. Slowly, her tone held something that unnerved him. Because, Miss Marple added, we have not yet discussed the matter of the second attack. Edith Halley trembled. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand upon her arm. You attacked Miss Halley 2 nights ago, Miss Marple said mildly. You believed she had seen something in the tunnel. Something damning. Crowthorne shook his head violently. This is nonsense, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but unrelenting. Oh no, Mr. Crowthorne. Miss Halley saw you standing near the rear door when you claimed you never moved. She heard the clink of metal, the clasp of the briefcase, perhaps as you pulled it free. Crowthorne's face flushed. She's lying. Edith shook her head fiercely. I'm not lying. You were there. I saw your silhouette. Crowthorne turned his glare upon her. You're frightened? Confused? And you followed her? Miss Marple said quietly. You followed her after the train stopped. You followed her 2 nights ago on the footpath. And when she realized she was being watched, you panicked. Inspector Graves stepped forward. If Miss Marple had not arrived at that moment, Miss Hallett might not be alive. Crowthorne's breathing turned ragged. His collar seemed too tight. His hands shook against the armrests. You can't prove any of this, he snarled. You have no evidence. Miss Marple smiled gently. No, then perhaps the next part will interest you. She reached to her side table drawer and retrieved a small envelope. Inside it was the torn strip of leather from the hedgerow. Crowthorne's eyes widened. Miss Marple held it delicately. This is from Mr. Redfern's briefcase. It matches perfectly, you know. And the Edith Hallepur. Frightened Edith saw the exact moment this staring occurred in the tunnel, where only you stood. The solicitor's composure broke completely. He slumped back in his chair, eyes wild. You can't trap me with teed and polite chatter, he burst out. This is absurd. Absurdity, Miss Marple said softly, lies in assuming that murder goes unnoticed by elderly ladies. Crowthorne attempted one last defense. This is a witch hunt. I demand to leave. Inspector Graves blocked the doorway. You'll stay until Miss Marple finishes. The solicitor's breath came fast and shallow. His face glistened with perspiration. Miss Marple sat back with calm finality. You poisoned Mr. Redfern before he boarded at Rosehill. You knew he was heading to London to expose your fraudulent activities. You followed him. Ensured he boarded the correct carriage. In the tunnel, you retrieved the incriminating briefcase, tore it open, threw it from the train, and attempted to make young James Linton your scapegoat. Crowthorne clenched his fists. You can't prove, Miss Marple cut him off softly. You were seen. The truth is rarely as hidden as murderers believe, and human nature is quite predictable, Mr. Crowthorne. Panic always reveals guilt. Inspector Graves stepped forward, voice low and firm. Lionel Crowthorne, you will come with us. Crowthorne's shoulders slumped. Defeat washed over his face. The trap had sprung. After Crowthorne was escorted out, the room fell silent. Edith exhaled shakily. Miss Marple, how did you know he would react that way? Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand gently. A guilty conscience is like a trapped bird, my dear. The moment it sees an open window, it tries to escape even if the window is painted on the wall. Inspector Graves, still stunned by the elegance of the trap, shook his head. I owe you more than thanks, Miss Marple. Nonsense, she said lightly. You did your part, Inspector. I merely nudged things along. Graves allowed himself a rare smile. You nudged a murderer straight into confession. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Well, one tries. As the inspector departed, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the street outside regain its peaceful quiet. The storm had passed. The truth had emerged. A murderer had been caught by the simplest of traps, human nature. Miss Marple folded her hands and murmured gently, "And now, the village may be allowed to breathe again." Chapter 10. The Truth on the Platform. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of crisp English morning where chimney smoke curled neatly into the sky and the church bells sounded particularly bright. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, Marleycombe Station held an air of purposeful tension. Inspector Graves had summoned all relevant parties to the platform. A quiet murmur rose from the small gathering. Edith Alley stood near the ticket office, pale but resolute. James Linton clutched his cap nervously. Several villagers lingered at a respectful distance, hoping to glimpse the end of a drama that had consumed their gossip for days. Miss Marple arrived last, walking with her gentle, determined steps. The inspector greeted her with genuine relief, for despite his official position, he knew that today's explanation belonged entirely to her. "Is everyone here?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Everyone," Graves confirmed. "Shall we begin?" Miss Marple nodded. Her eyes moved over the group, pausing briefly on Lionel. The solicitor stood stiffly between two constables, his face pale, his posture rigid, yet his eyes betrayed a desperate flicker, the look of a man who still clung to one last fragile hope. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. "It is only fitting," she began, "that the truth of Mr. Redfern's death be shared in the same place where it so nearly went unnoticed, Marleycombe Station." A hush fell. Even the sparrows seemed to pause. "Mr. Redfern," she continued, "did not die of natural causes, as some first believed. He was poisoned, and the poison was administered before the train entered the tunnel." James Linton looked stricken. Edith clasped her hands more tightly. Nor Miss Marple added gently, "Was this the act of a foolish or impulsive youth?" She turned her eyes toward James. "This young man is entirely innocent." James let out a shaky breath, tears springing unexpectedly to his eyes. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, perhaps you will explain how the poison was given." "Certainly," she said. "Mr. Redfern boarded the train in great haste at Rosehill Station. He had been followed there by the man who feared him most, a man who knew Redfern was carrying evidence of serious wrongdoing." She gestured toward Lionel. "That man was Mr. Crowthorne stiffened, but said nothing. Mr. Redfern," Miss Marple continued, "was on his way to London with documents proving Mr. Crowthorne had manipulated clients' funds. Exposure would have meant ruin professionally and personally." She continued with calm authority. "Mr. Crowthorne confronted Redfern at Rosehill. Whether he tricked him into accepting a drink or added poison to something Redfern carried, the result was the same. The poison was in his system before the train left the platform." A murmur rose from the onlookers. Miss Marple gently raised a hand. "Poison, you see, is rarely instantaneous. It requires time, and the journey from Rosehill to the tunnel provided just enough." She looked toward Edith Halley. During the tunnel, Miss Halley heard a sharp clink, the sound of a briefcase clasp being pulled apart, and she saw Mr. Crowthorne's silhouette in the corridor, though he later denied ever leaving his seat. Edith nodded, trembling. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Graves. "You received 3 statements confirming Crowthorne was not in his seat during the tunnel. All 3 cannot be mistaken." Crowthorne's jaw tightened. "Circumstantial," Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh no, Mr. Crowthorne. It was far more than that." Miss Marple lifted a small cloth bag. Inside was the torn strip of leather and the broken metal clasp. "This," she said, was found near the hedgerow by the tracks, along with the battered remains of Mr. Redfern's briefcase. The documents inside had been torn apart and left to the wind. She turned the clasp in her hand, letting the light glint off its bent metal. This was not an accident. It was forced open, and the scratch on the window frame of Carriage B aligns perfectly with the angle of removal. James Linton gasped softly. So the briefcase was thrown from the train. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and only one person had both the knowledge and the opportunity to do so under the cover of the tunnel. Inspector Graves took a step closer. And the fingerprints? Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Crowthorne's fingerprints were lifted from the clasp. A stubborn thing? A fingerprint? It stays long after the paper it protected is gone. A ripple of shock swept through the group. Edith Halley whispered, "He destroyed the evidence." Miss Marple continued, but not quickly enough. You see, Mr. Crowthorne believed that if Redfern's death appeared sudden and his briefcase vanished, suspicion would fall upon the nearest convenient victim. Her eyes softened. Young James Linton, frightened, naive, and easily framed. James choked on a breath. I never touched." "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "You did not, and now everyone knows it." But Miss Marple was not finished. "One more act," she said, "reveals the full desperation of the murderer." She turned again toward Edith Halley, who looked both anxious and brave. Mr. Crowthorne realized Miss Halley had overheard something in the tunnel, something that could connect him to the briefcase. Edith shivered. "He followed me." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "He followed you after the train stopped. And 2 nights ago, he attempted to silence you on the footpath, hoping that if you disappeared or were found injured, suspicion would fall once more upon young James." Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "This is the hallmark of a desperate man. A man who panics when cornered." Inspector Graves stepped forward, voice firm. "Lionel Crowthorne, you are charged with the murder of Albert Redfern and the attempted harm of Miss Edith Hall." The solicitor's composure fragmented at last. "You meddling old woman," he spat. "You've no right." Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "On the contrary," she said softly, "one must always stand where truth demands." After Crowthorne was led away, the platform slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Trains arrived and departed. Villagers dispersed. Life resumed its gentle course. Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the platform, hands folded neatly in front of her. Edith Halley approached her with hesitant steps. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "There is no need for thanks, my dear. You were brave, braver than you know." James Linton stepped forward next, hat in hand. They said I'd be free of charges. Truly free." Miss Marple nodded. "You are never in danger of true suspicion, James. Fear makes people look guilty, but only the unobservant mistake fear for crime." Tears glimmered in his eyes. "I won't forget this, ma'am." "Then take it as a lesson," she said kindly. "Be honest always, and do not let fear guide your steps." Inspector Graves joined her as the platform cleared. "You were right from the start," he said quietly, "about everything." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Not everything. I simply noticed the little things." Graves chuckled. "Little things solved a murder." Miss Marple watched a train pull into the station, steam billowing into the morning light. "Murder is rarely clever, Inspector," she murmured. "It is merely human, and where human nature walks, its shadows are never far behind. As she turned toward home, her steps were light, her heart quiet. The truth had come to light. Justice had been served, and the countryside, for now, could return to its peaceful rhythms. Miss Marple walked calmly down the lane, the mystery of the moving train at last resolved with nothing more than patience, observation, and an unshakable understanding of the hearts of men. I am glad to see that you are still here. Please like this video and subscribe this channel.